And so we're going to begin now. And this is the first in a series of shirim titled Heartfelt Brachot. Now I have to tell you that I find Brachot to be the most underappreciated expressions of Jewish theology. Meaning, we think about blessings as things you're supposed to say. But I believe blessings encapsulate things you're supposed to think, things you're supposed to feel. And all too rarely do we actually ponder the meaning of blessings, not just their mechanics, but their intentions. All too rarely do we reflect on exactly what we're saying when we're saying the words that we say. And this has come to a point where I'm so fascinated by Brachot that the sefer that I'm slowly writing is on Brachot Shechian, meaning I spend a lot of my time thinking about the real meaning of the blessing that we say called Shechianu, which we're going to spend quite a few sessions on in this series. But because our first session falls on Yom HaShoah, and because next week we'll be commemorating Yom HaZikaron, I want to spend the first two sessions at least exploring the bracha called Dayan HaEmet, which for most of us often simply appears as abbreviations when sadly we hear that somebody's passed away. You've probably seen on WhatsApp groups where it says BDE. You know, when somebody, God forbid, passes away, that's a knee-jerk reaction that people offer to express both empathy, understanding, to express sadness within a religious framework. And though I'm sure those are the intentions of people who use those formulations, I think few of us necessarily understand the Dayan HaEmet bracha. We often think it's merely about death, which it isn't. And we often think it's simply an acknowledgement of loss, which it kind of is, but slightly more subtle than that. So in today's session, I want us to explore the basic sources relating to the Dayan HaEmet blessing. We're not going to look at any clever commentaries. We're merely going to look at Mishnayot, Gemarot, the Rambam, and the law as formulated in the Aruch HaShulchan. But I think that alone should suffice. So you should be able to now see my screen. Is that right? And here there's a handout which is titled Dayan HaEmet on Personal and National Loss. My intention is for us to simply read these texts with care, and in so doing create our commentary around these texts, which we perhaps haven't had a chance to look at with the kind of nuance that we're going to do so today. So let's begin by looking at the first few sources, which is from Mishnah Brachot, chapter 9, Mishnayot Bet and Hey, Mishnayot 2 and 5. And this is the first time we're introduced to the Dayan HaEmet bracha. And I want us to read these texts carefully because automatically you're going to see a number of important features. Feel free, by the way, to interrupt if you have any queries or questions, and we'll pause in a second for any specific questions after each text that we study. So the first Mishnah in chapter 9, Mishnah 2 says, Ala kshamim v'ala psurot tovot, on the rains and on good news, Omer, we say, Baruch Hatov HaMeitiv. We say the blessing of Hatov HaMeitiv. We haven't defined what that is, but that's what we're informed. V'al shmuot ra'ot, and on bad news, shmu'ah means something that you hear. Omer Baruch Dayan HaEmet. We say the blessing Baruch Dayan HaEmet. Now, I want to point out two important things. Number one, it does not say on hearing that somebody's died, you say Baruch Dayan HaEmet. It simply says Al Shmuot Ra'ot, on bad news. And significantly, this introduction to Dayan HaEmet comes as a couplet to hearing good news, where we say Hatov HaMeitiv. Meaning you'll find that a lot of the core sources when talking about the Dayan HaEmet bracha contrast it with the Shechianu bracha or the Hatov HaMeitiv bracha, which, as Rambam is going to tell us later on, is a pluralized version of Shechianu. So On rains and on good news, hatov ha'meitiv. On bad news, dayan ha'emet. Now let's pause for a second. I want to hear from you. Do you have any questions about this first Mishnah? Feel free to open your microphone. I'd love to hear from you. Any questions about this statement? If not, let me start off and perhaps you can then elaborate on this. What does it mean, bad news? The Mishnah tells us, al shmuot ra'ot, when you hear bad news, omer baruch dayan ha'emet, you say this blessing. By the way, it's important to note that the Mishnah often condenses the wordings of blessings. And for our purposes, we're going to presume that this is a shortened version invoking the name of God, meaning Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam dayan ha'emet, rather than merely Baruch dayan ha'emet. Right? We're going to presume this is a full blessing invoking the name of God. But simple question number one, what does it mean by bad news? Let's take a simple day-to-day example. Imagine a person gets a C rather than B in a grade. Do you say a blessing of dayan ha'emet? It's shmuot ra'ot. You know, that for some people that's bad news. If somebody, God forbid, breaks up with a boyfriend, you know, they say baruch dayan ha'emet. Maybe if they didn't like them, they say shechianu. Who knows? The key point is that the Mishnah doesn't qualify what shmuot ra'ot means. But a further key point is, dayan ha'emet is certainly much, much broader than with reference to death. It's with reference to any bad news. Any thoughts? If not, we'll look into the next Mishnah. So let's proceed to Mishnah Hay. And Mishnah Hay is important because, as you're going to see soon, the way Rambam formulates his analysis of these blessings both intertwines the thinking of Mishnah Bet and the teaching in Mishnah Hay. So Mishnah Hay now doesn't just tell us the mechanics of the blessing. This is when you should say this blessing, and this is when you should say that blessing. But instead, the theology, the spiritual intentions. Chayav Adam levarech al ha'ra'ah kashem shu mevarech al ha'tova. A person is obliged to recite a blessing on bad in the same manner, or we could even say in the same spirit, that say the blessing on the good. I previously mentioned that in almost all cases where we're introduced to the dayan ha'emet bracha, it's compared with, that it's coupled with shechianu or hatov ha'meitiv. So here the Mishnah in Mishnah Brachot, chapter 9, Mishnah 5, tells us just as a person has got to say a blessing on the bad in the same manner as they do so on the good. That is, there are lessons to be learned about dayan ha'emet that we draw from hatov ha'meitiv, or we draw from shechianu. And he goes on to say, Shne'emar. How do we know this? It invokes a verse from the first paragraph of the Shema. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your resources. And here we have this powerful drasha, b'chol levavcha. It doesn't say b'chol libcha. There's a double bet here in that word, from which the rabbis draw the lesson. B'shnei tzircha, do so with both of your inclinations. B'yetzer tov or b'yetzer ra, with your good inclination, with your bad inclination. Meaning, love God with everything. Love God with your tendency to want to do good, with your tendency to want to do bad. Afilu hu notelet nafshecha. Love God even if God takes your life. And most famously, the Gemara in Brachot records how this is what Rabbi Akiva said as his life was being taken so viciously by the Romans. He said, I didn't know if I could fully fulfill the mitzvah of loving God with all my soul. Now I'm doing so. And then the Mishnah continues, B'chol modecha, with all your resources, B'chol memoncha, with all your money. Davar acher, the Mishnah continues. Another explanation, B'chol meodcha, right, with all that you have, B'chol midah u'midah shu moded lecha, have a model lo bim'od me'od. In every way that God measures you, in everything that God throws to you, praise God, bim'od me'od, very, very much. Now, I find this Mishnah to be both fascinating and a true theological challenge. It's telling us, as a follow-on of the discussions of the Birkat Shechianu, of Birkat HaTov HaMeitiv, of Birkat Dayan HaEmet, that we got to thank God, we got to praise God, we got to bless God for the good and for the bad. We've got to find a way to be able to say, Dayan HaEmet, when God is taking away our soul, and see that as a kiyum, as a fulfillment of loving God with everything. That whatever God throws to us, we got to talk to God and say, I acknowledge that this is you behind this. Modeh always doesn't mean thanks, but it does mean acknowledge. And so, Hatov HaMeitiv, Shechion and Dayan HaEmet are acknowledgements of God's role in the world. The acknowledgements of God's role when things are going well, and the acknowledgements of God's role when things appear not to be going well. Shmuot tovot and shmuot ra'ot. Now, I've spoken far too long. Any thoughts about both of these Mishnayot that we've looked through? Any questions or queries? We have a number of people here in the shiur, and a number of people have just joined us, so thank you. No, it seems to be a little quiet. So if that's the case, let's now see where else Dayan HaEmet features in the classic rabbinic literature of the Mishnah and the Gemara. And let's now look at two further teachings from the Gemara, one from Brachot Nun Chet Amud Bet, the next from Nun Tet Amud Bet. Nun Chet Amud Bet tells us the following: Tanu Rabbanan, our rabbis teach us, Haro'eh Batei Yisrael biyishuvan. Somebody sees Jewish homes in their being established, which is generally understood to mean if you see Jewish communities being grown or built, Omer, you say a beautiful blessing called Baruch Matziv Gvul Almana. Blessed God who restores the boundary to the widow. It's a fascinating blessing, and we'll talk about it at another occasion. But then we're told if you see Jewish homes, Jewish communities, b'churbanan, in their destruction, Omer Baruch Dayan HaEmet. Here too we say the Dayan HaEmet blessing. What we learn here is Dayan HaEmet isn't just about bad news, it's also about seeing things that cause anguish, pain. It's about seeing destruction or seeing the effects of destruction. Again, you'll note that in all these sources, no mention's been made of death. Mention's been made of bad news. Mention's been made of acknowledging God, even in the tough times, whatever God throws at you. Reference has been made of chubanan, of destruction. And then in Nun Tet Amud Bet, as a commentary of the Mishnayot that we've seen and some others too, this is where we first see Dayan HaEmet being mentioned with reference to death. And the case being discussed here is, what's the right response when, God forbid, a parent passes away? Whom you inherit? That means they pass away and you get their field, you get their money. Toshma, come and hear. Met aviv, if a father has passed away, V'hu yorsho, and you are the inheritor. B'tchila omer Baruch Dayan HaEmet. Beginning, you say Dayan HaEmet. You acknowledge the terrible loss of a parent. U'v'lasof hu omer Baruch HaTov HaMeitiv. You can also acknowledge the fact that now you've inherited their field and their money. Now, this tells us, by the way, that sometimes there's not such a big gap between the Dayan HaEmet blessing and HaTov HaMeitiv blessing. Sometimes they could be uttered almost in the same sentence. The Dayan HaEmet acknowledges loss. At the same time, there may be things that one accrues even in that moment of loss, and that too can be acknowledged with a different blessing. Here, HaTov HaMeitiv. And so here too, like the Mishnah in chapter 9, Mishnah Hey, where we said that there is this relationship between the good and the bad, for which both need to be acknowledged, for which both we need to see that this is God, involved in our lives. When a person loses a relative, they say Dayan HaEmet. They also, if they inherit, can say HaTov HaMeitiv. So this is, for our purposes, the core sources I'd like us to ponder. We're going to now see how Rambam formulates these laws in his own unique way. But what we learn from here, number one, is Dayan HaEmet, as I say, isn't a blessing about death. We learn from here is that there's a theological background of these blessings. We learn from here is Dayan HaEmet is often said either in conjunction with or in contrast to other more positive blessings, and that sometimes one can say one sad blessing or one Dayan HaEmet blessing, and then in a short breath, then say HaTov HaMeitiv. And I suppose what draws me to these blessings is because it's all about seeing God in the world. It's also about recognizing that sometimes there are ups in life and downs in life, and saying God's there and God's there. I see God's hand in this situation, but also in this situation. Any questions, thoughts before we proceed to the Rambam? You're a quiet bunch this morning. Besed, I suppose it is the morning. So let's now see how Rambam formulates all these laws. Often what he does is he paints a beautiful halachic tapestry based on the material found in the Mishnah and the Gemara. So this is how he teaches it in his Mishneh Torah, in Brachot chapter 10, halachot Gimel and Daled, and then later in Zayin. He says, Shamash Shmua Tova. If a person hears good news, Mevarech, you say the blessing, Brachot Hashem, Elokeinu melech haolam, HaTov HaMeitiv. And that's a blessing that person should say when they hear good news, if that applies not just to them, but to others as well. We're going to see that soon. Shamash Shmua Ra'ah, just like the Mishnah earlier on. If you hear bad news, Mevarech Baruch Dayan HaEmet. You say Baruch Dayan HaEmet. Now, according to this text, it would imply that Dayan HaEmet is a blessing you should avoid invoking God's name with, whereas HaTov HaMeitiv should be one that should use the name of God. However, there are different manuscripts of the Rambam. If you see, for example, the Yad Pshuta of Rav Nachum Rabinovich, you'll find that he includes God's name even in the Dayan HaEmet blessing. So let's presume that that's the case, and he too shortened his text of the blessing, just as I mentioned, the Mishnah sometimes does so. What we see here is basically an echoing of that first Mishnah that we learned. And then he goes on, and this is now his own language, V'chayav adam levarech al ha'ra'ah b'tov nefesh, kederech shemevarech al ha'tova b'simcha. Can you see, he now takes the wording of chapter 9, Mishnah 5, but then elaborates on it, and in so doing expresses his own understanding of what these blessings are all about. He says here, a person has to say the blessing on the bad, but tov nefesh, shall we call it, with the goodness of the soul, with a certain gladness of the soul. Kederech shemevarech al ha'tova. In the same manner that they say a blessing on the good, b'simcha. That is, that there is a parallelism between the word simcha, that you invoke for Shechianu blessings, or Hatov HaMeitiv, and Tov Nefesh. Tov Nefesh doesn't sound like Simcha, but it means, I suppose, making peace with what's happened. Shneimar, and he says, how do I know this? Well, he knows the Mishnah like we do. Etc., etc. You should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your resources. And he continues to say, sorry. And included in this additional love that we are commanded to do, with the Yetzer Tov, Yetzer Hara, means afilu be'et yitzorla. It means we're supposed to acknowledge God even when we are facing tough times. Yodeh v'shabech b'simcha. We're supposed to acknowledge God. We're supposed to praise God. And what we are learning here is, when bad things happen, our task is to acknowledge God in that wider picture. To try and achieve a certain sense of Tov Nefesh, maybe a sense of Simcha, as Rambam concludes with. This is a kiyum of mitzvah of loving God. That is, the blessings of Shechianu, of Hatov HaMeitiv, of Dayan HaEmet, are all subsumed in the mitzvah of loving God and wishing to acknowledge God's role in everything that happens to us. Now he goes on to tell us the following. Higia lav tova or sheshama shmu'at tova. If something good happens to you, or you hear good news, afa pisha dvarim mar'in shetova zu tigrom lo ra'a. Even if you think this good thing may well eventually cause you bad. I'll give you a simple example. Imagine a person wins a lottery. Most studies say that most lottery winners eventually end up being more miserable than they were before they won the money, right? He says, Mevarech Hatov HaMeitiv. Still you say the blessing of Hatov HaMeitiv. V'chein im naga elav ra'a. Similarly, if a bad thing happens to you, or shamash mu'ara, or you hear bad news, even if you actually think this bad thing will probably eventually lead to something good, nevertheless, you still say the Dayan HaEmet blessing. And why is this so? And this is really important to our understanding of the blessing. Because these blessings aren't meant to express our long-term understanding of the impact of these events. They're meant to be momentary expressions of how we relate to God. Right now, this is a good thing, so say Hatov HaMeitiv. Right now, there's a bad thing, say Dayan HaEmet. That may turn out bad, and this may turn out good. Right now, your task is to see God in this moment. That means these blessings are snapshot blessings. They capture our feelings in moments. Even if, in fact, the events may turn out different. Interestingly, in general, we don't say blessings that cause sadness on Shabbat. But with respect to the Dayan HaEmet blessing, we do say this bracha on Shabbat. Why so? Because it's about capturing the moment that you're feeling right then. It's about saying, right now I feel this emotion, and as a result of this, I feel a duty to say these words. I feel a duty to bear witness and say Dayan HaEmet, etc. And then in closing of these halachot, he gives us the klal that I've mentioned before, and he says, Amru lo met aviv yorshu. If they said to somebody, your father's died and you're going to inherit him, they have siblings and you say Dayan HaEmet for the loss and Hatov HaMeitiv for the gain. And if you're the only beneficiary, therefore you don't say Hatov HaMeitiv, instead you say Shechianu, because, as he says, this is a klal, קיצורו של דבר, כל דבר טובה, שהיא לא על אחרים, מברך הטוב והמיטיב, every good thing which is for you and for others, meaning more than one person benefit, then we invoke that טוב והמיטיב blessing. טובה שהיא לא לבדו, מברך שהחיינו. Whereas a thing which is just beneficial for you, you say, שהחיינו. Ad kan. The Rambam here hasn't added too much material that we haven't seen before, but he frames things in a particular way, in a particular order, adding sometimes his own language, his own perspective. What we learn from here is Dayan Hamet is a broad blessing. It's one which expresses emotions, but also it expresses a certain philosophy about our relationship with our Creator. It's a fulfillment of the mitzvah of loving God. And we say these blessings in moments. In a moment of loss, you can say Dayan Hamet. In a few moments afterwards, you may well be saying Hatov HaMeitiv. When you hear bad news, you may well say Dayan Hamet, and then later on it may work out to be a good outcome of sorts. As the Rambam in his commentary in the Mishnah explains, imagine a lake explodes, meaning the water explodes from a certain pipeline. That's bad. But in the end, it does benefit to your crops. So one may well be Dayan Hamet, but then later on you say, Shechianu or Tov HaMeitiv, if others benefit from it. Now, why is this so important? Why am I so fascinated by these blessings, by this category of brachot? Because they're heartfelt. Because it doesn't say when these things happen, check a siddur and then read it. It doesn't say ask a rabbi to figure out how you're feeling and then recite them. These are meant to be spontaneous blessings, expressing emotions, expressing attitudes in moments. These are theological communications. These are theological propositions the person offers in different chapters of their lives. Dayan Hamet, Shechianu, Hatov HaMeitiv. And as we see here, sometimes they often almost overlap. And what it tells us is, when we're having a day where things aren't going well and we hear bad news, see God in it. We're having a day when we hear great things, see God in it too. The very fact that almost all of us only say Dayan Hamet when we hear about the passing of somebody is, I think, actually tragic. Because it means we only acknowledge God with the hardest of news, but with the other stuff, we don't seem to care to identify God in that narrative, in that story. And yet, as the Mishnah was very clear, Shmuot Ra'ot, as Rambam said so too, if you hear bad news, then that's the words you should be saying. Now, the first question they asked at the beginning of the shir is, what is bad news? And you'll note that while a handful of examples have been given, including seeing a town in its destruction, including hearing about the passing of a person, very, very few examples have been given. Why so? Because for one person may be good news, may be for another person very bad news. And there's a subjective element in these blessings. It's as if it would be almost wrong to write a guidebook of all the times to say Dayan Hamet, because ultimately Dayan Hamet should be expressive of that person's experiences, that person's feelings, of the ups and downs of their life and the world as they see it. For one person, they hear news and they say, Baruch Dayan Hamet. They say those words. For another person, they don't quite see it that way. meaning license is given here to tie the head and the heart. In fact, I once defined the Dayan Hamet blessing as a blessing that comes from the mind while trying to counterbalance the pain in our heart. When we see bad things, and we try and make sense of it, and as a result of that, we reach out and we acknowledge God in the entire process. And knowing that in many ways, while there are rules about some dimensions of this blessing, most of the rules really are found in our heart is super important. It's super important to know that really it's up to us to say these blessings in terms of personal loss and in response to national loss. When we hear bad news, that's the words we should be saying. And I'd say especially when we hear about a loss of a person, the knee-jerk reaction of BDE or Baruch Dayan Hamet, the people write, in social media and WhatsApp groups, well, I know coming from the right place, I think is often a misunderstanding of the nuanced nature of this blessing. We think BDE is almost giving comfort to another person, as if I'm sorry for your loss. BDE is a personal expression. These are words that should be coming from you. These are a theological acknowledgement of God's role in whatever just happened. Often when I hear bad news, I have to take a moment to get to the point when I feel I can say, Baruch Dayan Hamet. Because you're saying something big in those words. So it shouldn't be something that we throw out, I think. I think it's something we should reflect on and digest before we express it. Nonetheless, that expression should be one that comes from the self and reflective of the moment. Any questions from what we've said so far?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Hi. If like the whole point, like what the Rambam was saying, is that you have to acknowledge like God's role in what happens, how's like your immediate reaction to acknowledging how, like if a loved person has just died and you're acknowledging God's role in it, like why would you go and praise God straight away? You know what I mean?
So I think it's a great question. And I said the word modeh sometimes means praise, but more often means acknowledgement. And I think what these teachings are trying to bring to our attention is a need to join the dots in our lives, is a need to see God in everything that happens. Because if we don't, we almost separate ourselves from God's interaction with the world and God's interaction in our lives. As people of faith, we have to see God in what happens. But what we're beckoned to do through these blessings is that when a bad thing happens, to take a moment and say, I may not understand this, but this too came as a result of God's decree. Now, I must make it clear, if God forbid somebody is murdered, God didn't do the murdering. Today is Yom HaShoah. As Dennis Prager and Joseph Telushkin make it very clear in their book, The 9 Questions People Ask About Judaism. God did not build the crematoria Auschwitz, mankind did. Still, we need to acknowledge that God is part of the overall picture. And this makes Dayan Hamet actually both a really important blessing, but also a really challenging blessing. Now, in order to see how challenging, I want us to just look through the next couple of sources and let's see if this helps Mia's question, may sharpen her question, or may well address it. Because the Aruch HaShulchan, Yechiel Michael Epstein, tries to make sense of how this operates, shall we say, in the real world. In the real world of, he was a community rabbi, he understood He was many times, obviously, leading prayers at burials. He understood the theological challenge of what it means to say Dayan Hamet when somebody's in bitter mourning. And he says the following, Al Besorot Ra'ot Mevarech Dayan Hamet. He says, on bad news, remember, we should be saying this in many situations. It's just all too often we're only saying it in the hardest, and we don't understand, therefore, what the nature of this blessing is all about. He says, Besorot Ra'ot, on bad news, Mevarech Dayan Hamet, B'Shem Malchut. He says, don't forget to include God's name. It's not just Baruch Dayan Hamet. You say the blessing with a full usage of God's name. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Dayan Hamet. Please note that most of us don't do that, which kind of means that we're not really feeling the sentiments we're expressing. We're simply expressing as kind of like a either kitsur bracha, but I would say also kitsur emotion. He says, if you really feel it, you would really be invoking the name of God. And he says, it's important to know that when you say this blessing, there's no distinction is drawn whether the bad thing is happening to you, or whether it's also happening to others. The nature of this blessing is about tziduk hadin. It's about trying to find justice, trying to acknowledge justness in this decree from heaven. Kedichtiv, and here he invokes those words from Parshat Ha'azinu, Hatzur Tamim Pa'alo. The rock, perfect is his work. These are words that we say, by the way, at the Levaya. V'ein chiluk ben ra'at haguf, and no distinction is drawn whether this is harm that's done to a person's body, that means an injury as well as a death, or ben ra'at mamon, or financial loss. If, God forbid, a person's house burnt down, they would say Dayan Hamet. If they were robbed, think about that too, God forbid. V'gam ken kol echad lefi orko. And Aruch HaShulchan says, and let's be perfectly clear, every person will relate to this blessing differently. That means the measure of saying this blessing will be based on what's valued by that person. And this is the same with respect to the good. Meaning, what for one person is not a big deal loss, another person is a big loss. And it's a subjective blessing. It depends on how you feel about this moment in terms of whether you feel that loss such that you would say Dayan Hamet. But Dayan Hamet, in terms of theology, is a big deal. Hatzur Tamim Pa'alo. You're saying God is part of this picture. And then he goes on and he says, bringing the Mishnah that we've seen before, but then adding so much more. Shanu Chachamim b'Mishnah da'ro'eh. Our rabbis have taught in the Mishnah Brachot, Chayav Adam levarech al ha'ra'ah, kashem shemevarech al tovah. A person is obliged to say a blessing on the bad in the same manner they say it on the good. Hainu levarech al ha'ra'ah b'dat shlema. That is to say a blessing on the bad with full knowledge or the full understanding. U'b'nefesh chafetza, kederech shemevarech b'simcha l'tovah. With a desirous heart, in a way that a person blessings for good with joy. A bit like the language that we saw above of Rambam, do you remember? Where he talks about B'tov Nefesh. And he goes on and he says, Ki ad ra'ah le'ovdei Hashem, because bad for a servant of God. Hi tovatam, at the end of the day is for their benefit. V'simchatam, at the end of the day, they need to find some good in it. A person in that moment is being asked to accept upon themselves with love that which God has decreed upon them. In that moment, a person should say, whatever is happening to me is an atonement for my transgressions. And it would come from this that by accepting the bad, this servant of God, and this is a service of God, and this is acknowledging God and showing a love of God. Etc., etc. As we said in the Mishnah, in everything that God measures you, as I said, in everything that God throws at you, hen midat tova, hen lehefech, whether for the good or the opposite, have a model, acknowledge God, b'mod ma'od. And now he comes and explains. Zeush Amar David, this is what King David says in Psalms, in Tehillim Kuf Aleph, Chesed u'mishpat ashira. Right? Kindness and justness I will sing. Klomar, as if to say, whether God relates to me through kindness, or whether God relates to me with justness, meaning with harshness, I'll still praise God. I'll still sing to God. I'll still talk to God, and I'll still acknowledge God. V'Yov Amar, and Yov said, Hashem Natan v'Hashem Lakach, Yishem Hashem Avorach. God takes, God gives, God takes. May God's name be blessed. And that's what we're doing with Dayan Emet. Olam, he says, and ultimately a person should always endeavor to try and say those famous words, Kol David Rachmana Tav Avid of Rabbi Akiva, whatever God does is for the good. And a person of understanding will appreciate that things in this world, they're hevel varik, right? They're just temporal. They're just a moment. Like a shadow passing. Chalom ya'uf, like a dream that's flying away. Having analyzed the blessing, what we learn is Dayan Ha'emet is an enormously significant blessing. It's an enormously powerful one. It says so much. But it's words we're encouraged to say in the different moments of our lives. It's a way where we wrestle with our lives and God's role in it. We wrestle, but we still acknowledge that no matter whatever is happening in our life, God is part of it. And God is often the decider of the fate we're experiencing. So are there any thoughts, Mia? Does that respond to your question, or does it sharpen it?
I don't know. Just gave me more to think about. I don't know. Yeah.
But you can see there's a certain challenge being thrown to us by this blessing. But when we say this blessing, we're saying so much beyond the mere words. And yet, if you recognize that Dayan Ha'emet and Shechianu and Hatov HaMeitiv shouldn't merely be offered on moments, God forbid, of loss of life, but on hearing bad news of you or others, what these become are regular expressions of seeing God in the world. The fact is, and this is why we're going to be having a course on this topic, we are quite quick to invoke Dayan Ha'emet, although I think few of us necessarily stop to ponder the full gamut of what that blessing is all about. But very, very few of us say Shechianu or Hatov HaMeitiv. I find the Orthodox Jewish world quick to say the right formula when we hear bad news, and slow to say any formula when they hear good news. Quick to acknowledge God in loss, but rare to acknowledge God in gain. But you'll have seen in all these teachings that there is a constant dynamic between the good and the bad, between the Tovah and the Ra'ah, between referencing Shechianu Hatov HaMeitiv and Dayan Ha'emet. And I think we find Dayan Ha'emet either both easy and also incredibly difficult, precisely because we kind of use it wrong or in a too limited manner. There were when we hear good news that we'd say Hatshechianu. We hear good news that benefits ourselves and others, we say Hatov HaMeitiv. When we hear small bad news, we'd say Dain Hemet. Then we would understand what Chazal saw to be expressions of personal relationships with God, expressions of our love of God and our seeing the hand of God in our lives, which are offered on a regular basis, because in any given week there are ups and downs, there's good news and bad news. But we don't say the positives enough. I think we say the negative, the Dain Hemet, often, but with limited thought. And it means our appreciation of the dynamic between these two worlds of seeing God in the good and the bad. And our understanding of what Chazal wanted us to do with these blessings has been somewhat misdirected. I said at the beginning of this shiur that Brachot are powerful theological statements. And I think now we're starting to appreciate how powerful they are. But they're not just theological statements on the big things, on the national catastrophes, on individual churbans, that is, God forbid, if a person loses a relative, if a relative dies. But they're also about seeing God in the small moments, in the small ups and downs. Seeing God in the regular roller coaster of our life. And I think if we were to do that more, we would make sense of these blessings in the more tough challenges, such as those we've explored today. Okay, we're going to be wrapping up in a few moments. Are there any questions that you'd like to raise, any points you'd like to make based on the sources we've learnt or the ideas that I've shared? I see somebody about to either reach a screen or they were just about to write something down. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is consider, as of now, and we're going to be meeting up again next week, what is Dayan Hemet? What is it not for the nation of Israel, but for me as an individual? What do I think about when I say these words? And how often do I say it? How would my life change if I said Dayan Hemet actually more regularly? But not, God forbid, because my life gets grossly worse, but because I identify the moments in my life where I should be saying the blessing. There are shmuot ra'ot in our lives, and there are also shmuot tovot. Right? We hear good things, we hear bad news. At each moment, we're supposed to call out, we're supposed to be ashira, we're supposed to sing to God and say, I see you, I hear you. I acknowledge that what's happening is because of you. As the Aruch HaShulchan said, don't just do the shortened version, Baruch Dayan Hemet. Say God's word, because this is all about your relationship with God. This is all about your complicated love relationship with God. Complicated because sometimes it's tough. Sometimes it's truly tough to love God with everything. That whatever God throws at you, B'chol David, as he said, but B'chol David Rachman Tav Avid, that's a tough call. But that's what he says we're being asked to do. Whatever God does for us, we've got to try and see tav in it, some kind of good. But even if the word good is tough to swallow, we still need to see God. And by saying Dayan Hemet, that's what we're holding on to. Dayan Hemet isn't necessarily about saying, I make sense of this moment. But it's saying, notwithstanding the difficulty in this moment, I know God's part of it, which means I'm not alone. So this is why I think these blessings are so important. They are heartfelt blessings. They're not just blessings in response to emotional challenges, but they're emotional blessings. To go back to my definition, I think Dayan Ha'emet is a blessing that comes from mind, meaning it's something that we're supposed to think about while trying to counterbalance the pain in our heart. I mean, while trying to align it with a sense of loss, a sense of distress, and sense of pain and anguish. And that process is what V'ahavta Hashem Elokecha is all about. B'chol levavcha, with all your heart. B'chol nafshecha, with all your soul. B'chol meodecha, with all your resources. We say those words, and what those words ask us to do is, when moments of good come, say more words. Say more words of Shechianu Atov HaMeitiv. When moments of pain, loss, when bad news comes along, say other words, Dayan Ha'emet. And say, whatever happens, I love you, God, and I know you love me. And that we have a heartfelt relationship. Okay, I think we're going to end now. I look forward to learning with you next week. I wish you a meaningful Yom HaShoah V'Gvura. And of course, we'll try and stay in touch. Okay?
Thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Look
Thank
after
you.
yourselves.